This is exercise 15, where we're looking at the histology of nerve tissue. With the nervous system, there are different types of cells. We have the neuron, but we also have supporting cells that are referred to as neuroglial or just glial cells. In the central nervous system, there are 4 different types of these neuroglial cells: the astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglial cells, and the epidermal cells. In the peripheral nervous system, which is everything outside of the brain and spinal cord, there are 2 types of neuroglial cells: the Schwann cells and the satellite cells. So this diagram here is showing just some pictures of what representations of what some of these cells would be looking like. And this is another chart depicting the various types of microglial cells separated by peripheral nervous system versus central nervous system. In terms of their function, you should be talking about those more in your lecture course. The neuron, which is the main functional unit, if you will, of the nervous system, is the cell that is capable of transmitting these electrical impulses. There are different regions or parts of the cell. There's the cell body that's known as the gray matter. Now you'll notice that when we talk about the nervous system, we often will give different terms or names to things. So where you have a group or a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system, it would be called nuclei. Groups and clusters of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is going to be known as ganglia. The dendrites are the areas on the neuron that do receive the electrical impulse from other neurons. And then the axons, that is where it's going to be sending that charge away from the cell body. They're typically longer than the dendrites. Right at the area where the axon connects to the main cell body is the axon helix. The very end of the axon is called axon terminus or axon terminal. In the synaptic cleft, that is the little space that's going to be between the neuron and an adjacent neuron or the muscle or the gland that it is. So if we look at this picture over here, and of a typical neuron stretching through here, here's the cell body. That's where the nucleus is, the mitochondrium, most of the organelles. These smaller extensions here are the dendrites, so they could be receiving an impulse from another neuron. This area right here, where this is the axon, connects to the cell body, is the axon helix. It kind of looks like a funnel. And then as you see, the axon extends down here. Now, oftentimes, but not always, the axon will have some of these glial cells that wrap around and help to support the axon. They're helping to insulate it as that electrical charge is moving down. This is the axon terminal area here, the very end of it. On the very end, we refer to as the terminus. And the synaptic cleft would be the distance between this axon terminus and whatever the adjacent cell is. So this little point here refers to right here. This is the axon terminus. This is the synaptic cleft, this space. So this would be the presynaptic cell. This is the postsynaptic cell. The postsynaptic cell could be another neuron. It could be. In terms of that protective insulating sheath around the axon, that's formed by some of the glial cells in the central nervous system. It is going to be the oligodendrocytes. As you see here, you have extension, and it wraps around providing that insulation. In the peripheral nervous system, it's the Schwann cells that will wrap around providing the insulation. It's much like, if you're familiar with electrical wiring, how you have your wire and then you have the rubber insulating around it. You'll find out it helps to make the transmission of that electrical charge much faster. The neurons we can classify several different ways. We can classify them by structure. We can classify them by function. If they are classified by structure, You can have anoxic neurons, where you have several different processes, but you really can't tell the axon from the dendrite. A bipolar neuron, this is where you have the cell body, excuse me, and it is separating distinctly. You basically have one dendrite here and one axon here with the cell body in the middle. A pseudo-unipolar neuron, the cell body's to the side, and then you have the extensions. The majority of what we see in the human body are multipolar neurons. That's where you have the cell body, you have multiple dendrites, but the axon is much longer and extends out. But there's just one single axon. If you classify neurons by structure, then we classify them as one of three types. There is the sensory, also known as the afferent neuron. This is receiving this electrical impulse, the stimulus, and it's sending it towards the central nervous system. Remember, the central nervous system is brain and spinal cord. The interneurons are also known as association neurons. This is what is linking the sensory to the motor. And then the motor or efferent neurons, they are receiving electrical impulse, excuse me, and they are sending it away from the central nervous system. So typically what happens is the receptor picks up some stimulus, maybe it's pain, maybe it's temperature, whatever that stimulus is, the sensory neuron then is stimulated, sends that to the central nervous system. The interneuron is going to receive that information and then send it further then down to the motor neuron, which is then going to stimulate whatever response you have. So what happens is the blue here is your afferent or sensory neuron. It's going to have received the stimulus. It's going to send it up to the central nervous system. Now you're going to have your association or interneuron right here. Oh, what should we do? Well, let's tell her to move her hand. So it's going to send that message to the motor neuron, which comes down here. In this case, it would stimulate the muscles to contract to have me move my hand. So once again, the central nervous system, if you have bundles of axons, we're going to give it a different name. It's going to be referred to as a tract. And when you have a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system, that whole bundle is going to be referred to as a nerve. Sensory is sending to the central nervous system, motor is sending away. When we talk about having a mixed nerve, so a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system, that bundle would contain both sensory and motor fiber. When we look at the nerve itself, you're going to see different layers. The endoneurium, this is connective tissue that's surrounding each individual axon. The perineurium is going to be surrounding a group of axons, bundling them into fascicles. And then the epineurium is the connective tissue that surrounds a group of fascicles. So if you look at this picture here, over on the right-hand side, this small yellow tube, that is the nerve fiber itself. That would be like the axon. It will have around it, initially, the little tiny white areas are the myelin sheaths that are helping to insulate it. The light blue is the endoneurium. Endo is always going to be the innermost one, around the individual fiber. You group several of these fibers together, and they are going to be wrapped by the perineurium. This bundle that's wrapped by the perineurium is referred to as a fascicle. You put all of these fascicles together, and then that's going to be wrapped by this darker yellow color, which is the epineurium, the outermost. So endo's always innermost, peri's middle, and epi's going to be the outermost. This is very similar to what you saw with the muscles and the way the muscle fibers are wrapped as well.